He gave her 30 days. She gave him something he never expected himself. What would you do if your entire life was built on control and the one person who sees through it all is the one you're about to lose? Charles Whitmore was a man who lived by rules. No mess, no emotion, no attachments, just power, precision, and a temporary secretary he swore would be gone in a month. But then came Ellie Harris. She didn't try to impress him. She didn't play by his rules. She simply showed up with honest eyes, a messy purse, and a quiet strength that unsettled everything he thought he knew. When rumors threatened her reputation and silence nearly broke what was growing between them, Charles had to choose: protect his empire or open his heart. If it were you, what would you choose? This is not just a love story. It's a story about second chances, about healing, about choosing someone not because it's convenient, but because it's right. So make yourself a warm cup of coffee, lean in, and let this story remind you that it's never too late to rewrite the ending. If this story touches you, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs a little light today. Now, let's begin. He'd built an empire with numbers and walls, but it was a simple resignation letter with no drama, no demands that shook Charles Whitmore more than any boardroom battle. It was a Thursday morning in late April, and the golden sun of Savannah crept through the high windows of his office, casting soft shadows across the dark oak floor. The city outside was already humming the buzz of traffic, the footsteps of early risers along River Street, the scent of azaleas thick in the warm air. But in the corner office on the top floor of Whitmore & Co., time had taken on a quieter rhythm. Charles sat alone at his desk. The letter lay in front of him, folded with precision, her handwriting neat but not distant. There was no bitterness in the words, no self-pity, just gratitude and goodbye. His fingers hovered over the page, tracing the curve of her signature like he was memorizing something he shouldn't have forgotten. Eleanor Harris. He said it aloud, barely more than a breath. The name felt too heavy, too final, hanging in the room like perfume that wouldn't fade. A month ago. She had walked into his office wearing a second-hand blazer, hair pinned up too quickly, and a quiet certainty in her eyes that didn't match the resume in his hand. She wasn't supposed to matter. He had hired her because Andrew, his COO, said they were short on staff. Because she was temporary. 30 days. That was the deal. It had always been the deal. Charles Whitmore didn't do permanence. Not with assistants. Not with people. After Megan left 3 weeks before their wedding, with nothing but a note on the kitchen counter, Charles had rearranged his life into something clean and reliable. Work was safe. Numbers never lied. People, well, they often did. He'd built walls around everything that hurt, and they'd held strong for 3 years. Until Eleanor Harris showed up with a mug of tea he didn't ask for, and a comment about how the old brass doorknob in the hallway reminded her of her grandmother's front porch. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flirtatious. She didn't try to impress. She just noticed things. And she made him notice, too. At first, it was small. The way she reorganized the client files so the color-coded system actually made sense. The way she remembered to schedule his dentist appointment without asking. The way she left a sticky note on his monitor one morning with nothing but the quote, "Joy is often found in quiet places." He'd scoffed, and yet he hadn't thrown it away. That same note now sat in his drawer, folded behind a collection of business cards and an old cufflink. He stood up slowly, walking toward the tall windows. Savannah's skyline was a mix of history and ambition, church spires beside steel and glass. He had always loved that balance. Until now, he had believed he understood it. Ellie had brought something into his office that didn't belong on spreadsheets or balance sheets, something that couldn't be measured. It made him uncomfortable, but also curious, and then she had gone. Just like that. 30 days. Exactly. She hadn't asked to stay. She hadn't hinted that she wanted to, and maybe that's what unsettled him most. Charles had built his company on discipline and logic, but no part of him felt logical now. The letter was still in his hand, and he realized he had read it 3 times already. But he didn't remember a single word. All he could think about was the last look she gave him yesterday. A soft smile, no resentment, just acceptance, like she knew something he didn't. He moved back to his desk, set the letter down gently, and sat. The chair creaked under his weight, a sound so familiar it usually comforted him. But not today. His eyes scanned the desk. Everything was in place, just like always. The sleek black fountain pen, the silver-rimmed clock, the unopened folder for next week's board meeting. But someone was missing. Ellie had only been there for a month, and yet the air felt quieter without her. The silence less restful. He reached into the drawer, pulled out that yellow sticky note, and stared at it for a long time. The ink was slightly faded. Joy is often found in quiet places. He'd ignored it. He couldn't afford joy. But maybe he'd been wrong. The thought surprised him, but it didn't leave. His hand brushed over the envelope again, the texture worn slightly at the fold. She hadn't sealed it. That felt intentional. Charles leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, then opened them again with something that hadn't lived there in a long time. Longing. Not for possession, not even for answers, but for understanding. He whispered, barely audible, like he was speaking to the room, or maybe to himself. How did it even begin? The question hangs in the air. And to find the answer, we must go back 30 days earlier, to a woman with a messy purse and honest eyes. She arrived 5 minutes early, lipstick smudged, a book sticking out of her purse, and eyes that looked like they'd seen both storms and sunshine. The receptionist barely glanced up before gesturing toward the leather armchairs against the wall. "He's running behind," she said. "You can wait over there." Ellie Harris nodded politely, but didn't sit down. Her purse slipped from her shoulder as she adjusted her blazer, faded navy blue with a missing button at the cuff, and tucked the paperback novel back into the bulging side pocket. She checked her reflection in the window, noticed the faint line of pink on her teeth, and wiped it away without fuss. Then, instead of heading to the waiting area, she did something most applicants wouldn't have dared to do. She walked straight toward the door marked Charles Whitmore, CEO, inside. Charles sat hunched over a legal pad, reading notes scribbled in his precise, angular handwriting. His office, like the man himself, was controlled. Clean lines, cool tones, a curated mix of old-world charm and modern function, nothing out of place. Until she walked in, she knocked once, but didn't wait. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, as if she'd already been introduced to the man he hid behind his title. "I know I'm early, but if you're already behind, I'd rather start now than waste both our time." He looked up, and for the first time in weeks, his routine cracked. She wasn't what he expected. She didn't offer some overly rehearsed greeting or hand him a glossy resume. She didn't apologize for the interruption. Instead, she offered a quiet kind of confidence. The kind that came from learning life doesn't wait until you're ready. Charles motioned to the seat across from his desk, curious despite himself. "Eleanor Harris," she said, settling in. "But everyone calls me Ellie." He studied her for a moment, her worn purse, her unpolished nails, the strand of hair that refused to stay tucked. She didn't fidget, she didn't flatter. She simply smiled, and something about that smile. It wasn't charming. It was real. Charles scanned the file Andrew had left for him earlier. Bachelor's in English, master's in counseling, former student advisor, let go from her last university position after a disagreement with administration. He raised an eyebrow. Disagreement. Ellie met his gaze evenly. I stood up for a student when no one else would. Turns out, integrity isn't always good for job security. There was no defensiveness in her tone, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of the cost she'd paid. Charles set the folder down. He hadn't even asked the other applicants anything yet today, just let his assistant handle the filtering. But this one wasn't playing a part. He glanced at the clock. Technically, your scheduled time isn't for another 20 minutes. Ellie smiled again. Then I'll consider this volunteer work. It wasn't her resume that intrigued him. It was her presence. She had this unshakable calm, like someone who had weathered more than her fair share of hard days and still managed to show up on time, if not entirely put together. Charles cleared his throat. The position is temporary. 1 month. She nodded. That's what I was told. No guarantees of extension, no personal involvement, strictly professional. Fast-paced. Demanding. I've worked in education, she replied, almost teasing. You'd be surprised how similar it is. He nearly smiled, but didn't. Something inside him, however, leaned closer. She wasn't looking for a second chance. She was offering a steady hand to a place that might not even deserve it. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he didn't want her to leave the room just yet. He leaned back, giving her one last glance over. If his past had taught him anything, it was not to trust first impressions, but there was something about the woman in front of him, something that felt like solid ground, and Lord knew he hadn't stood on that in a long time. Your desk is outside this office, he said. Finally, you'll start now? 30 days. No more. She nodded, rose smoothly, and adjusted her bag. As she reached the door, she turned back just slightly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitmore. And with that, she was gone. Charles stared at the door a moment longer, fingers tapping a rhythm against the desk. She might be trouble, but not the kind he was used to. Outside, Ellie sat at her new desk, adjusting to the silence, the stares, and the weight of what she didn't yet know. That 30 days could change everything. 1 month, he said, that's all I can offer. She nodded, but life never follows contracts. The ink was barely dry on her temporary contract when Ellie Harris slid into the rhythm of the office, or rather, the lack of it. Whitmore & Co. wasn't the kind of place where people chatted at the water cooler or brought in birthday cupcakes. It was quiet, polished, and cold in a way that made even the coffee taste serious. Charles Whitmore liked it that way. He made it clear from day one she was there for function, not friendship. 30 days, no exceptions, no questions, no warmth. Ellie didn't take it personally. After all, she wasn't there to make friends, either. Mornings began early, long before the city's charm fully woke up. Savannah's Spanish moss still dripped dew when Ellie arrived, the quiet click of her flats echoing in the marble lobby. She'd bring 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with a dash of cream and cinnamon, because Charles hadn't asked, but she had noticed. He never commented on the cinnamon, but he stopped throwing the second cup away. Their interactions were efficient, professional, laced with subtle tension. He gave instructions. She followed, until she didn't. 3 days into her contract, the assistant director bungled a major media release, misquoting Charles in a local publication and sparking backlash about a redevelopment project in a historic neighborhood. The board panicked. The media circled. The phones rang. endlessly, while Charles met with lawyers, PR consultants, and board members. Ellie quietly read the original transcript of the interview. Then she typed up a statement. Not legalese, not defensive, just a human acknowledgement of the misunderstanding, coupled with a community-focused pledge. She printed it out, walked into his office, and laid it on his desk. Charles didn't look up. Now's not the time. It is, she replied gently. He glanced at the paper, read the first few lines, stopped, read them again. Did someone on the comms team write this? No, Ellie said. Just me. A suggestion. That's all. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't flashy, but it worked. The local media reprinted the revised statement within hours. A neighborhood committee that had been planning a protest canceled their meeting. One even sent flowers. Charles didn't thank her. Not exactly. But the next morning, her office chair had been replaced with an ergonomic model, and her desk had a new reading lamp. Ellie smiled to herself. Not because of the lamp, though it was lovely, but because she knew what it meant. It was his way of saying, I see you. Still, he never strayed from the rules. 30 days? No more, no less. In the evenings, Ellie would go home to the tiny apartment she shared with her younger sister. Lily, or more often, to the small storefront Lily was trying to convert into a coffee shop near River Street. They painted walls together under weak fluorescent lights, scraping off old adhesive, salvaging second-hand furniture. Lily talked in bursts about new recipes, logo designs, dreams of freedom. Ellie mostly listened, hands busy, heart tired. You okay? Lily asked one night, dabbing a stripe of paint across Ellie's arm like a child. Ellie laughed. I'm fine, just tired. Of the job? Ellie paused, then answered softly, no, of knowing it's going to end before it even begins. Back at the office, Charles continued to enforce the invisible lines he'd drawn. He didn't ask about her weekend, didn't mention the press release again, didn't question how she made things easier, smoother, quieter. But he noticed everything. The way she greeted the cleaning crew by name. The way she offered tissues without asking when a staff member came in with red eyes. The way she hummed quietly, always off-key when she thought no one was listening. One afternoon, Charles stood outside the break room door longer than he meant to, listening to the soft hum of Ellie's voice. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it made him feel something. And that unsettled him. That night, after everyone else had gone home, he pulled up her file again, scanned the simple summary. Education, counseling, dismissed for professional conduct concerns. He remembered asking about it during the interview. He remembered her honesty, and he remembered how rare that was. The next morning, as Ellie stepped into the office, she found a small note on her desk, written in Charles's precise script. Good instincts yesterday. Thank you. That was it. No signature, no smiley face, no follow-up. But Ellie folded the note and placed it carefully in her planner. Later that day, during a meeting with the board, Charles was asked if he planned to extend Ellie's contract beyond the trial month. He didn't even hesitate. No renewal, he said. 30 days. Still, no one argued. Why would they? But Ellie, standing just outside the glass door, heard him. She blinked once, smiled to herself, and kept walking. The skies over Savannah began to shift, and one rainy evening, everything they thought they understood about themselves and each other would quietly begin to unravel. Sometimes, it's in a storm when we see most clearly. That night, Savannah rained, and something shifted forever. It wasn't the kind of rain that came and went. It was the steady, unrelenting kind that soaked through sidewalks and bent trees sideways, the kind that quieted the city, That made people stay indoors and listen, really listen to what was happening within their own walls. Inside Whitmore & Co., most of the staff had already gone home. The power flickered once, then steadied. Thunder rolled low across the skyline. A few cars splashed through the empty street below. Ellie stayed late to finish filing compliance paperwork, the kind no one noticed unless it was done wrong. She didn't mind. The office was peaceful when it was quiet, less sharp somehow. Across the hall, Charles was still at his desk, coat off, sleeves rolled, forehead lined with the kind of tension he wore like a habit. At 6:45, the receptionist called to say the street was flooded. No cabs were running, no ride shares, no buses, just rain. Ellie laughed softly when she heard the voicemail. It wasn't frustration, more like the tired amusement of someone who'd learned long ago not to argue with what she couldn't control. She poked her head into Charles's office. "Looks like we're both stuck here for a bit." He looked up, surprised to see her. "You haven't left paperwork. And now, puddles." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. No point waiting alone." She hesitated, just for a second, then crossed the room and sat down, her blouse slightly damp from where the window had leaked on her side of the building. They sat like that for a few beats. No urgent emails, no clipped questions, just two people, breathing. The storm outside softened everything. The lights above hummed low. Rain tapped steadily on the window panes. "Does Savannah always flood like this?" Ellie asked. Charles gave a half smile. "More than we admit. The city's beautiful, but unpredictable." She nodded, like most beautiful things. There was a pause, a long, honest pause. He leaned back. "You're not like most people I've worked with." She met his eyes. "You mean I talk too much and bring cinnamon into your coffee?" He let out the softest laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. Ellie looked around his office, her gaze settling on a photo frame tucked behind a row of books. A woman in a white dress stood beside Charles. Both looked young, hopeful. "You were going to get married," she said, gently. Not asking, just noticing. Charles followed her gaze. 3 years ago. She left before the wedding. Ellie didn't respond right away. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and said, softly, "My mother died 6 years ago. Cancer. Quick and cruel." Charles turned toward her, his expression shifting, something unspoken in the space between them now. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm not," Ellie replied, then paused. "At least, not in the way people expect. I had time to say goodbye. Not everyone gets that." She smiled, but it was the kind that held weight behind it. He studied her then, the woman with the messy purse and the quiet courage. The one who came in early, stayed late, and somehow still hummed when she filed quarterly reports. "You never talk about yourself," he said. She shrugged. "No one ever asks." And somehow that simple answer said more about her than any resume ever could. They sat in silence again, but this time it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt shared. The rain softened outside. Streetlights cast long shadows through the glass, and for a moment the office didn't feel like a place of power. It felt like a room with two people trying just a little to let someone in. Ellie stood up, walking to the bookshelf. She picked up the photo frame, held it gently, not prying, not judging. She looked kind, she said. Charles nodded. She was, just not meant to live in the world I built. He didn't take the photo from her, didn't flinch, and for the first time since that day 3 years ago, he looked at the picture without pain rising in his throat. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze back to Ellie. not to change the subject, not to avoid the past, but because the present was finally asking to be seen. Ellie set the photo down exactly where she found it. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Eventually, Charles broke the silence. "I'll have the car take you home when the road's clear." Ellie nodded. "I'm in no rush." And in those 4 words, something softened even more. He didn't move the photo, but for the first time in years, he looked at it and then looked away. Outside, the rain would stop. But inside, a different kind of storm was quietly taking shape, one fueled by whispers, headlines, and a past that refused to stay quiet. In business, reputation is gold, and gold burns fast when thrown into gossip's fire. It started with a whisper, as it often does. A glance held too long in the hallway. A second cup of coffee left on Ellie's desk. A chuckle from Charles during a rare team meeting, the kind that people noticed because he never laughed. At least, not like that. By the end of the week, the whisper had become a hum, and the hum grew teeth. An anonymous email made its way to the company's legal team, then to the board, then inevitably to Charles. The subject line read, "You might want to vet your secretary better." Inside was a screenshot of a news article from 2 years ago, a quiet scandal at a small liberal arts college in Vermont. A staff member, unnamed, was allegedly involved in an inappropriate relationship with a married professor. No formal charges, no legal consequences, just speculation and fallout. The screenshot was followed by a line. "She's done it before. What makes you think you're different?" Charles read it once, then again. He wanted to dismiss it, wanted to toss it into the digital trash with every other baseless accusation that crossed his inbox, but he didn't. Because he couldn't ignore the part of him that felt cornered. Not because he believed the rumor, but because he had started to believe something else, something more dangerous. That he looked forward to seeing her, that the air in his office felt easier to breathe when she was around, that maybe, just maybe 30 days didn't feel like enough anymore. And that was the problem. He had spent years building walls. And now, in less than a month, a woman with a soft voice and a stubborn will had found her way in. Across the office, Ellie knew. She could feel the shift. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way silence looked at her now. Cautious, calculated. She wasn't surprised. Not really. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to rewrite her story, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But it still hurt. She didn't defend herself, didn't ask who sent the email. Didn't try to explain that the married professor had manipulated students and staff alike, and that her real crime had been reporting him. She had learned long ago that sometimes truth didn't matter to people who had already made up their minds. The board scheduled an emergency meeting with Charles. Ellie wasn't invited. The next day, there was a quarterly review presentation, a high-stakes meeting with investors and city officials. Ellie had prepared the entire agenda, designed the slide deck, and double-checked every financial figure twice. But 15 minutes before it began, she walked to Charles's office. He looked up. Not cold, just distant. "I won't attend today," she said calmly. "You're the one who built the presentation." "I know." "Then why?" She smiled gently. "Because they'll look at me and see a headline, not a team member. And I won't let your work be questioned on account of mine." There was nothing dramatic in her tone, no anger, no pleading, just dignity. She turned to leave. "Ellie." She paused. He wanted to say something, something that would undo the silence between them, but he didn't. Because the truth was, He didn't know if he was protecting her from the storm or protecting himself from what it would mean to stand beside her in it. So instead, he said nothing. She left the room without a word, and he didn't follow. But something in him screamed that he should have. The storm wasn't over, and when the resignation letter came, it wasn't loud, it was quiet, but it changed everything. Her resignation came on a Monday. Folded neat, no drama, just the kind of goodbye that hurts more because it's quiet. It was there on her desk, no envelope, no frills. A single sheet of paper with clean lines and carefully chosen words, typed, signed, dated. Charles found it at 7:12 a.m. When he passed her workspace on his way in, coffee in hand, half expecting to see her already seated, already focused, already humming something soft beneath her breath. But her chair was empty, her desk was clear, and the letter was waiting. He stood there for a long time, holding it without unfolding it, as if the longer he waited, the more he could delay what it meant. Then, slowly, he opened it. Mr. Whitmore, thank you for the opportunity to serve with your team these past 4 weeks. I've learned more than I expected, and not just about business. I respect what you've built, and I leave with no resentment, only gratitude for the time I was trusted to contribute. I wish you continued success. With sincerity, Eleanor Harris. No defense, no explanation, no bitterness, just grace. Charles read it twice, then 3 times. The words didn't change, but the ache in his chest deepened with every pass. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat in silence. The city outside buzzed with its usual rhythm, but inside, something had gone still. At 8:47, an internal report landed in his inbox. It was a quarterly performance review prepared by the strategy team. Numbers, trends, missed risks, caught early. At the end of the file, someone had added a footnote. Note a significant number of these recovery actions were initiated or flagged by Ms. Harris. Her early intervention saved 3 key accounts from escalation. Charles stared at the line. He didn't remember assigning her to those cases. He didn't remember even discussing them. But now he remembered the mornings she'd left sticky notes on his desk, the late emails she'd quietly sent to clarify misaligned invoices, the way she stepped into meetings not to take space but to hold it. He leaned back in his chair, the resignation letter still in his hand, now creased at the corners. Ellie hadn't just shown up. She had mattered, and he'd let her go. Not because she failed. Not because she was wrong for the job, but because he was afraid of crossing a line, afraid of what it would mean to see her fully, afraid of where it might lead. He hadn't chosen her. He'd chosen control, chosen the safety of detachment, of silence, of distance, and now she was gone. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping against the hardwood. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. His calendar was full. 10:00 A.M. Staff strategy session, 11:15 A.M. Call with Boston investors, 1:00 P.M. Lunch with potential partners, 2:30 P.M. Press interview. He closed the laptop. Then he reached for his phone, typed a message to Andrew: cancel all my meetings. Indefinitely. There was no reply. Not yet. Charles grabbed his coat, barely noticing the April drizzle tapping against the windows. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't have a speech planned, but for the first time in years, that didn't matter, because he knew. He knew exactly where he needed to go. Somewhere near River Street. A small coffee shop was just opening its doors, and behind the counter stood a woman who had no idea someone was finally choosing her. She wasn't expecting him, not at her sister's coffee shop, not with that look in his eyes. The bell above the door chimed soft, like a memory trying not to startle the present. Ellie looked up from behind the counter, a dish towel in one hand, a small vase of wildflowers in the other. She was helping Lily arrange the tables, the kind of small detail she always paid attention to, even when no one else did. It took her a moment to register who he was. Out of his usual tailored suit, in jeans and a charcoal jacket. No briefcase, no phone in hand, just him, raw and unsure. For a long breath, neither of them spoke. Then Charles said, quietly, "This place suits you." Ellie set the vase down. "You're far from downtown." He nodded. "I needed to be." The room was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon, espresso, and something sweet baking in the back. Lily's laughter floated in from the kitchen. But in the space between them, it was just silence and something not quite said. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he added. Ellie folded the towel in her hand. "Good, because I'm not ready to give it." He nodded again, slower this time. "I know." He stood still for a moment, as if uncertain whether he should continue. But then he stepped forward, placing something on the counter between them. Her resignation letter, worn now, creased from being handled too much. "I've read this more times than I care to admit," he said. "And every time, I wondered what would have happened if I'd simply, listened." "To the rumors?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "No," he replied. "To myself, to what I was afraid to admit." He looked down. His hands were clenched, then slowly loosened. "I'm not good at this, Ellie," he said. "At people, at emotion, at not hiding behind structure and plans and contracts." She didn't answer, and he didn't expect her to, so he kept going. "I thought if I stayed in control, nothing could hurt me again. But you—" He paused, choosing his words like they might change something. "You reminded me that being human isn't a liability. It's the only thing that matters." The shop remained quiet, save for the hiss of the espresso machine behind her. Ellie looked at him, eyes unreadable, but not cold. "You said you didn't come to ask forgiveness." She said, "I didn't." He replied, "I came to ask something else." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a manila folder, neat, professional, but not impersonal. "It's a proposal," he explained. "We're launching a community outreach branch. It'll work with underserved neighborhoods, small business support, education grants, housing access." He placed it on the counter. "I want you to lead it, not because of us. Not because of what I feel, but because I've seen what you do when no one's watching. Because this," he tapped the folder, "gently needs someone who understands people more than spreadsheets." Ellie opened the folder, scanned the outline. It was good, detailed, honest. He hadn't just created a job. He had built something real. She closed it, took a deep breath, then met his gaze. "You didn't follow me when I walked away," she said. "I know. You let me leave." "I did." She leaned on the counter, hands resting on the wood. "So why now?" Charles swallowed, then said simply, "Because the silence was louder than I expected, and because I finally want something I can't schedule or manage or explain away." Her face softened, not with affection, not yet, but with something like recognition. "You still want control," she said. He almost smiled. "Probably always will. And I still need space. I'll give it." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the folder again, flipping to the second page. There, in small print at the bottom, was a sentence that didn't feel corporate at all. People first. Always. She looked back up at him. Her eyes weren't guarded this time. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's more than I hoped for," he replied. As she walked from behind the counter to see another customer, he turned toward the door, but before he reached it, he paused, looked back. "I'll wait," he said. "Not a demand, not a plea, just a promise." And this time, she believed him. The papers would stay unsigned for now, but hearts, they had already started moving quietly, steadily, towards something neither of them dared name. Yet, some people rewrite rules, others rewrite themselves. She did both. It started quietly, without ceremony, no grand announcement, no ribbon cutting. Just a spare office in a renovated brick building on the west end of Savannah, a borrowed desk, and a handwritten sign taped to the door that read Community Impact Division, Building Futures, One Step at a Time. Ellie stepped into the role like she belonged in it, not with swagger, but with steady presence. She built programs from the ground up: youth mentorships, small business support, literacy initiatives, and Charles. He let her lead. He showed up to meetings, yes. He signed off on budgets, yes. But mostly, he listened. And that, Ellie would later admit to Lily, was what surprised her most, not that he gave her a title, but that he gave her room. They didn't speak much about the past. They didn't need to. There was a rhythm now: work calls in the morning, planning sessions over lunch, late-night reports exchanged with quiet trust. It was professional, mostly. But the space between them had changed. There were glances that lingered a second longer, conversations that carried into parking lots, moments of stillness that felt personal, yet neither crossed the line. Not because they didn't want to, but because something deeper was being built. Ellie had made it clear she didn't want to be anyone's second chance. And Charles, he wanted to be more than the man who couldn't let go of control. So instead of rushing toward romance, they built something rarer: mutual respect. Then came the deal. It was the kind of contract that made investors lean forward and analysts nod in approval: a multi-million-dollar redevelopment plan in Atlanta. Prestigious, profitable, polished. The partner was a tech mogul with deep pockets and a charming smile. Too charming, Ellie thought, after their first lunch meeting. At the next gathering, he interrupted her mid-sentence. At the third, he asked if she was just there to take notes. Charles said nothing at the time, but Ellie saw the flicker in his jaw, the tightening of his grip around the water glass. Still, she handled it with the same grace she always did, deflecting, redirecting, returning to the work. But after the final negotiation session, when the deal was all but done, the partner made one last comment offhand, laughing. "She's a nice face to have around. Polishes your image." Charles didn't laugh, didn't even blink. He closed the folder in front of him, stood up, and said, without raising his voice, "Some deals aren't worth signing." The room went silent. He turned to Ellie. She met his gaze, calm and steady. Then he turned to the door and walked out. She followed. They didn't speak until they were outside, the late spring breeze brushing through the trees along the street. "You didn't have to do that," Ellie said quietly. "I did. It was a huge deal. It was a small price for something bigger." She looked at him. "And what's that?" He met her eyes. "Your dignity, your place, your name in that room." A long pause settled between them. "You once said you don't do personal," she said. "I used to say a lot of things," he replied, "and now I'm learning how to mean something different." She nodded slowly, looking up at the sky, where clouds were starting to part. "You're rewriting your rules." Charles smiled. "No, we are." And for the first time, she didn't pull away from that word. The line between partnership and something more was no longer a line. It was a path, and both of them had started walking it together. She came for a paycheck. She left with a purpose, and somewhere along the way, she stole his heart. There was no announcement, no social media post, no grand declaration that Charles Whitmore, the famously reserved CEO, was now in a relationship with the woman once hired to organize his calendar. But people noticed. It was in the way he stood a little closer when they spoke, in the way she no longer knocked before stepping into his office, in the quiet glances shared between project meetings and planning sessions, glances that didn't ask permission anymore. They worked side by side, but now it felt less like cooperation and more like harmony. Together, they reimagined the company's tone. The once stiff corporate culture began to soften one program at a time. Ellie led literacy workshops in underfunded schools. Charles personally visited the small businesses they funded. Employees were encouraged to volunteer, not just perform. At the annual conference, the theme was no longer growth and profit. It was people first. They launched a scholarship in Ellie's mother's name for young women pursuing degrees in counseling. Ellie didn't cry during the announcement, but her hands shook slightly when she stood beside Charles on stage, and he gently reached over, just a light touch on her arm to steady her. It was the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken, because it had already been proven. Her birthday fell on a Sunday. She didn't expect much, maybe dinner with Lily, maybe a walk by the river. What she didn't expect was the painting. He gave it to her at the office, after hours. No fanfare, just a canvas wrapped in brown paper, leaning against the edge of her desk. She tilted her head. "You didn't have to, I know," Charles said, "but I wanted to." When she unwrapped it, her breath caught. It was hers. A painting she had made 10 years ago, long before student loans, long before she stopped calling herself an artist. A simple watercolor, a tree growing through a crack in stone. Fragile, unlikely, but alive. "I thought I lost this," she whispered. "You sold it," he said softly, "to pay rent your last year of grad school. I tracked it down." She turned to him, eyes wide. "You remembered?" Charles gave a small smile. "You described it once, after that long meeting with the city council. You said you missed the version of yourself who painted that." "I didn't forget." Ellie looked back at the painting, her throat tight. "I found the gallery in Vermont," he continued. "They'd sold it to a collector. It took a few weeks, but here it is." She didn't speak, couldn't. He stepped closer, not as a boss, not as a businessman, just a man who had learned, finally, how to see, how to listen, how to love without needing to fix or possess. "You're not the same woman who painted that," he said. She met his eyes. "No, I'm not. You're more." Ellie nodded. "And so are you." The silence between them was full now of trust, of time, of every moment that had led them here. He didn't kiss her, didn't need to, because sometimes the truest love isn't in the grand gestures. It's in a painting returned, in a hand resting gently on your arm, in someone choosing to remember who you were and believing in who you've become. That night, as they stood by the window, the Savannah skyline glowing in soft orange light, Charles looked at her, not as a secretary, not as a colleague, but as a woman who had changed everything he thought he knew about himself. He looked at her as a man in love deeply, quietly, and finally, without fear. The 30 days were long over, but what came next wasn't an ending. It was a beginning neither of them had dared to write, until now. 1 month as his secretary, a lifetime as his equal. It had been a year, 12 months since Ellie placed a quiet letter on a polished desk, 12 months since Charles chose presence over pride, purpose over profit, love over fear. They never rushed it. No sweeping romance headlines, no diamond-studded announcements, just slow Sundays, mornings filled with mismatched mugs and the scent of cinnamon, shared notebooks on community projects. Evenings spent repainting walls in Lily's cafe and building something that wasn't just theirs, it was for others. 2. When Charles proposed, it wasn't at a gala or beneath fireworks. It was in the back room of the coffee shop, sitting on flour bags, both covered in frosting from a baking mishap. "I don't want to marry an idea," he'd said. "I want to build a life with someone who calls me out when I disappear behind numbers and stays when it gets messy." Ellie didn't cry. She smiled, then laughed, then said, "Only if we never use the word perfect again." He slipped a ring on her finger, nothing extravagant, just meaningful. And from that day on, they didn't call each other fiancé or bride-to-be. They called each other right place, right time, because that's what they were. Not soulmates written in the stars, just two people who found their way through silence, storms, and second chances. The wedding was held in the garden behind Lily's coffee shop. Lily had insisted. "No ballrooms," she declared. "You guys already live in boardrooms." There were paper lanterns strung between trees, jazz music floating softly from a Bluetooth speaker, no press, no suits, no scripted vows, just 30 guests, people who had shown up when it mattered. Employees, friends, a few mentors, a couple of former critics turned supporters, and one young scholarship recipient who now called Ellie her North Star. Charles wore a linen shirt and forgot his tie. Ellie wore a tea-length dress with paint smudges on the hem remnants from the final mural she and Lily had painted on the side of the shop, a tree growing from cracked stone. As they exchanged vows, Charles didn't promise perfection. He promised practice, patience, partnership. Ellie promised honesty, laughter, and space to grow. When the ceremony ended, no one clapped loudly. They just stood in soft applause, eyes full of the kind of emotion that doesn't always make it into photographs, but stays longer than most memories. Later that night, after the cake had been cut and Lily was dancing barefoot with a tray of espresso shots, Ellie and Charles stepped outside. The street was quiet. Warm lamplight glowed from inside the shop. They stood beneath the awning, hand in hand, watching the world move at its gentle pace. A small wooden sign now hung beside the cafe door, carved by a local artist, painted in Ellie's handwriting. It read, "Where love, coffee, and second chances are always served." Charles traced the words with his finger. "I used to think second chances were only for people who failed," he said. Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder. "And now I think maybe second chances are how we become who we were always meant to be." She smiled. The sound of Lily laughing inside spilled into the street. The soft clink of mugs, the smell of coffee, the hum of something peaceful. Ellie looked at him. "You know," she whispered, "I never planned to stay longer than a month." Charles turned to her, his voice full but quiet. "I know, but I'm glad we both forgot the rules." They stood there a little longer, beneath the soft buzz of the porch light, not needing more, not chasing more, just being together. And somewhere in the stillness, beneath the moss-draped branches of old savanna trees, two hearts that had once built walls finally felt home. Sometimes, the most meaningful connections in life don't come with fireworks. They come quietly through shared silences, everyday choices, and the courage to show up as you are. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive in grand moments. Often, it comes through small acts of respect, of listening, and of choosing kindness even when it's hard. Ellie and Charles were both broken in quiet ways, but it was their willingness to grow, to face the discomfort, and to see each other fully that allowed something beautiful to take root. For those of us who have loved and lost, who carry regrets or fears, this story offers a gentle truth. It's never too late to start again, to build something slower, deeper, and more real. Not all second chances come wrapped in romance. Sometimes they come in the form of understanding, or simply being seen. And perhaps that's the lesson, that love is not about perfect timing, but about showing up when it matters most. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we'd be so grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the quiet strength in all of us. Until the next story, take care and be kind to your heart.